Alright, I guess we're back, and I hopefully will have fewer technical difficulties. This is the first real technical difficulty I've faced since live streaming, but hopefully not so bad. Last time we did skeptical theism proved. It was more proving the skeptical than the theism, but it's that's fine. That's what they were trying to do, at least. Someone named Perry Hendricks. I was wondering if it was there's another philosopher, Hendricks, Vincent. I didn't know if it was him or not. Alright, so phenomenological reviews. It's a review. Philosophia, Closer to Truth, Peter Bauman. We often think or say that someone was wrong about something. Someone was wrong on the internet. You have to do something about it. We often think or say that someone was wrong about something, but almost right about it or close to the truth. This can mean more than one thing. Here I propose an analysis of the idea of being epistemically close to the truth. So you're wrong, but not that wrong, or you're right, but you're not quite right. This idea plays an important role in our practice of epistemic evaluation and therefore deserves some detailed attention. You know, this looks just sort of a lot of detail. And, well, let me just see if it's there. Maybe I'll do it. But, oh, it is here. Focus on reliabilism, closeness to the truth. Section 3 mentions why this is useful. One having to do with the Gettier problem. Yeah. Even sounded like it when I was saying that thing 2 seconds ago. Alright. That's why it's roulette. Okay. Oh, what was that? It's a DocX. I don't have... You know what? I don't have a DocX viewer set up on this for this computer yet. So we're not doing that. I can do a PDF. That's all I can do right now. That was that's also new. Something I'm gonna write that down. Okie doke. Next. The threat of the intuition-shaped hole from Inquiry, an interdisciplinary journal of philosophy. Well, holes. Let's see. The only natural enemy of the pile. Is it available? I won't even read the abstract if it's not available. It is not available, so I'm not going to read it. Alright. And this is back to yesterday's, or a few days ago stuff. So, you know, maybe what we'll just do is randomly scroll down to a spot and start looking again. Sex, wars, SlutWalks, and carceral feminism. Okay. "22 pages. Ah. Okay, so sex wars, SlutWalks, and carceral feminism. And I have absolutely no idea what this is, but we are going to read it nonetheless and see if I can say something non-moronic. In recent years, scholars have identified a political formation that mobilizes the emancipatory energies of feminism in the service of the expansion of the carceral state. Carceral feminism, as has come to be known, is often portrayed by these scholars as a product of feminist conservative convergence. Here I argue that the rise of the SlutWalk movement suggests a more complex genealogy for carceral feminism. By situating SlutWalk in the historical theoretical context of feminism's sex wars, I reveal the carceral feminism impulses roiling beneath its progressive sex-positive surface. with its tendency to reduce sexual freedom to expressive freedom, valorize conventional forms of femininity and heterosexuality, and promote fundamentally carceral paradigm of sexual freedom. The SlutWalk movement, I argue, is descended from anti-censorship pro-sex feminism, a liberal feminist hybrid that emerged out of the convergence of sex radical feminism and liberalism during the sex wars. When viewed in this light, SlutWalk no longer appears as a sign that feminism's pleasure and danger factions have negotiated long-awaited sex détente. Rather, it stands as a testament to the extent to which feminism's once radical aspirations in the domain of sexual politics have been supplanted by a tepid, heteronormative, and disquietingly carceral liberal project. Okay. In recent years, a body of scholarship has emerged identifying a political formation that mobilizes the emancipatory energies of feminism in the service of the expansion of the carceral state. These things. Carceral feminism, as sociologist Elizabeth Bernstein has dubbed it, figures criminalization, policing, prosecution, and incarceration as integral to women's liberation, constructing gender justice as a matter of criminal justice. Within the scholarship, carceral feminism is portrayed as primarily a product of the confluence of feminist and conservative energies. For example, in her study of contemporary anti-trafficking activism, Bernstein associates the anti-trafficking movement's embrace of carceral paradigms of justice with a rightward shift and feminist conservative alliances formed between the feminists and organizations like the Hudson Institute. Similarly, Mimi Kim attributes the anti-domestic violence movement's turn towards punitive carceral policies to strategic decisions made by anti-domestic violence activists to ally themselves with conservative politics of law and order in an effort to feminize and control the criminal justice system. While there is no denying that the feminist conservative convergences highlighted by the scholarship have contributed to the rise of carceral feminism, certain strands of contemporary feminist politics, particularly contemporary feminist sexual politics, indicate that the genealogy of feminism's carceral turn may be more complex than this narrative of feminist conservative convergence lets on. Consider, for example, the transnational anti-rape protest movement known as SlutWalk. The SlutWalk movement began on April 3rd, 2011 in Toronto, Canada, when some 1,500 people, mostly women, donned miniskirts, fishnets, and other slutty attire and marched to the headquarters of Toronto Police Service. Billed by organizers as SlutWalk Toronto, the purpose of the march was to protest a TPS officer's remark at a public safety forum that in order not to be raped, women should avoid dressing like sluts. Given these precipitating circumstances, one might imagine SlutWalk Toronto carries a bold anti-carceral message, highlighting instances of the criminal justice system's complicity in sexual violence and injustice such as prison rape, sexual assault by law enforcement officers, and police harassment of sex workers and sexual minorities. However, this was not the case. As SlutWalk Toronto's website explains, the aim of the march was to call foul on TPS for engaging in the sort of slut-shaming that deters survivors from reporting their victimization to police, and to demand that police take serious steps to make survivors, slut or otherwise, feel respected and protected. Okay, so, yeah, not the same thing. The goal, in other words, was more vigorous law enforcement on behalf of sluts. Within a year, SlutWalk Toronto had inspired similar events in approximately 200 cities around the world, and a global grassroots SlutWalk movement had emerged. Okay. While SlutWalk's rise from local demonstration to transnational phenomenon had elicited some criticism from feminist quarters, many prominent feminists have embraced the movement. For example, according to popular author and blogger Jessica Valenti, SlutWalks herald a new day in feminist organizing when women's anger begins online but takes to the street when a local step makes a global waves. Well, that is nice when you actually get to do something. Similarly, when no one's walking around nowadays in big groups, it's just kind of scary out there. Similarly, veteran socialist feminist activist Selma James hails SlutWalk as the new women's movement born out of student protests and Arab revolutions, tearing up the past before our very eyes. Philosopher Judith Butler's assessment is equally sanguine. When asked about the SlutWalk marches in 2011, Butler describes them as exemplifying a new kind of public assembly that harnesses a sense of vulnerability and injurability on the streets to engender modes of solidarity that resist the limitations of identity politics while contesting neoliberal conditions of precarity. Butler has recently reaffirmed this position, describing SlutWalks as a public and courageous takeover of public space. Perhaps the highest praise garnered by the SlutWalk movement has come from scholars who frame it as a long-awaited resolution of feminism's sex wars. The sex wars were a series of conflicts over matter pertaining to sex and sexuality that embroiled the feminist movement in the United States and Canada from the mid-1970s to the early 1990s. During the sex wars, sex radical and anti-pornography feminists squared off over a whole range of issues, including pornography, prostitution, and S&M. Despite pleas for both sides to come together to create a movement that speaks as powerfully in favor of sexual pleasure as it does against sexual danger, the sex wars raged for decades, resisting any definitive resolution. To scholars familiar with this history, the SlutWalk movement's pairing of audacious assertions of feminine sexuality with strident denunciations of gender-based violence signals a long-awaited sex detente, as legal scholar Deborah Turkheimer has observed. By taking aim at rape while expressly promoting the virtues of female sexuality, SlutWalk situates itself where anti-rape and pro-sex norms converge. Carr has seconded this analysis, praising SlutWalkers for speaking in a voice that deplores sex violence while embracing sex positivity. I see where this is going. Okay, not bad. And hopefully I can get through it. It's 22 pages. Extolled by the feminist left and lauded by scholars as a Hegelian synthesis of feminism's long-standing pleasure and danger antinomies, the SlutWalk movement is in no sense a product of the sort of feminist conservative convergence scholars claim is fueling the rise of carceral feminism. In fact, conservative feminists like former British MP Louise Mensch, nay Bagshaw, have harshly criticized SlutWalk for lionizing promiscuity, making sluttishness a mark of feminism. Nevertheless, despite its progressive, sex-positive ethos, the SlutWalk movement, in at least its North American instantiations, is as steeped in politics of carcerality as any of the conservative feminist projects highlighted by scholars of carceral feminism. My primary aim in this essay is to offer an explanation of how this came to be. How did a feminist movement that is vigorously sex-positive and oriented toward the progressive left come to embrace punitive carceral politics of law and order? How did a feminist project that takes sexual pleasure and freedom as its raison d'etre come to align itself with the carceral power of the state? Because you go where the power is when you want to get something done sometimes. To answer these questions, I will draw on recent scholarship highlighting the role of liberalism in the feminism sex wars. As scholars like Duncan Bell and Judith Shklar have observed, liberalism is a hyper-inflated all-purpose term that can be used to signify everything from progressivism to its opposite. In the present work, I use the term to denote a range of positions premised on the belief that freedom of the individual is the highest political value, and that freedom of conscience, freedom of occupational choice, privacy, and family rights all place limits on what governments may do. At the heart of liberalism, so conceived, is a distinction between the public and private, where the public is figured as a sphere of justice in which law serves as a neutral guarantor of liberty among free and equal individuals, while the private is figured as a sphere beyond justice in which law and liberty are fundamentally at odds. Yeah. I mean, when does that actually work? But okay. While liberals have traditionally presented the public-private distinction as a means of securing individual liberty against the encroachments of overweening governments, feminist political theorists have noted its utility for other purposes, as they have rightly done. As Carol Pateman has incisively observed, given the way in which women and men differently locate within private life and the public world, liberalism's public-private distinction obscures the subjection of women to men within an apparently universal egalitarian individualist order. Yeah, because whoever is the real individualist comes out on top on this. Other people aren't, when they're not treated as well, all fall to that the ideal individual sort of candidate. It is liberalism in the sense, I argue, that played such a crucial role during the sex wars. The earliest rumblings of the sex wars began in the latter half of the 1970s, when feminists began articulating perspectives on pornography and a whole host of other matters pertaining to sex and sexuality that challenged traditional liberal perspectives. Whereas liberals had long fended off conservative calls for censorship, by figuring pornography as private, apolitical, and harmless. Feminists during the sex wars insisted that pornography was public, political, and potent. Anti-pornography feminists argued that pornography threatened women's physical, civil, and economic well-being, while sex radical feminists defended pornography and sexuality more generally as indispensable to human freedom, community, and identity. Initially, liberals resisted these dueling feminist perspectives. They were wary of the brazen defenses of pornography and sexuality offered by sex radical feminists, and they saw anti-pornography feminism as little more than old-fashioned commstockery and newfangled feminist drag. However, in the mid-1980s, in the midst of a robust public debate surrounding a municipal ordinance that would have made pornography actionable as a civil rights violation, all of this began to change, and liberal variants of both anti-pornography feminism and sex radical feminism began taking shape. In this article, I summarized these developments with a primary focus on the strategic appropriation of liberal civil liberties and anti-censorship rhetoric by sex radical feminists in the mid-1980s. While this strategy won sex radical feminists important short-term gains, in the long run, I argue, it led to the eclipse of sex radical feminism by a liberal feminist hybrid discourse that I call anti-censorship pro-sex feminism. In this liberal feminist hybrid, I argue that has fueled the rise of the SlutWalk movement. Despite its resemblance to Take Back the Night marches pioneered by anti-pornography feminists in the late 70s and its continuity, at least in some respects, with the playful prurience of sex radical feminism, the SlutWalk movement, I argue, is no straightforward reconciliation of sex war era antinomies. Rather, with its tendency to reduce sexual freedom to expressive freedom, valorize as opposed to problemize conventional forms of femininity and heterosexuality, and promote a fundamentally carceral paradigm of sexual freedom, the SlutWalk movement is a descendant of the anti-censorship pro-sex feminism, and thus a product of the union of sex radical feminism and liberalism that the sex wars occasioned. One that recognized as such, the SlutWalk movement no longer appears as a sign that feminism's once bitterly divided factions have come together in some new and vital political coalition. Rather, it stands as a testament to the extent to which feminism's once radical aspirations in the domain of sexual politics have been supplanted by a tepid, heteronormative, and disquieting carceral liberal project. Okay. Yeah, 17 minutes to read 4 pages. Prior to the sex wars, debates concerning sexual freedom in the United States were largely two-sided affairs centered around the topic of sexual expression. Conservatives like 19th century anti-vice crusader Anthony Comstock argued that all sexual expression from straightforwardly pornographic works to vocatios decameron were obscene, from the Latin for filthy or inauspicious, and deserving of legal suppression. Liberals responded to these conservative calls for censorship by insisting that sexual explicit materials were harmless vice, deserving of moral opprobrium and some form of governmental regulation, but not outright prohibition. John Stuart Mill's remarks on liberty concerning offenses against decency reflect this quintessential liberal view. There are many axiomal rights which, being directly injurious only to the agents themselves, ought not to be legally interdicted, but which, if done publicly, are a violation of good manners, and coming thus within the category of offenses against others, may rightfully be prohibited. Of this kind, Mill continues, are offenses against decency, on which it is necessary to dwell, as they are only connected indirectly with our subject, the objection to publicity being equally strong in the case of many actions not in themselves condemnable, nor supposed to be so. Mill's equivocal defense of offenses against decency lived on well into the 20th century, shaping the thinking of some sexual expression's most prominent liberal defenders. For instance, an influential 1981 essay, Ronald Dworkin vindicated the right to pornography construed as a right to the voluntary consumption of depressingly obscene photographs and films in private, while simultaneously defending prohibitions against the display of such photographs and films in public. Even the cadre of civil libertarian attorneys and publishers who challenged the Comstock-era regime of obscenity and regulations head-on in the 50s and 60s embraced this ambivalent view. For instance, Charles Rembar, the attorney who exonerated the first unexpurgated American edition of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lover from obscenity charges in 1959 and pioneered the legal strategy that would lead to the exoneration of dozens of other sexually explicit works throughout the 60s, lamented the more permissive sexual culture his legal victories helped bring about. There is an acne on our culture, Rambar wrote in the concluding chapter of his memoir, The End of Obscenity, pointing to a glut of books, magazines, advertisements, and films that play upon concupiscence and peddle sex with an idiot slyness. We approach, Rambar warned, a seductio ad absurdum. Alright, that, you get like +1 for seductio ad absurdum. As Rambar's reflections on the end of obscenity events, a profound ambivalence lay at the heart of mid-20th century liberal opposition to obscenity regulation. While liberals defended sexually explicit expression as, for the most part, harmless, they also lamented its prevalence and denounced it as ignoble and base. Some even recommended eliminating legal restraints on obscenity as means of eradicating it. For example, the argument Harold Price Farringer, attorneys for the publisher of Hustle and Screw, presented at New York University School of Law colloquium in 1978. Obscenity, Farringer explained, breeds and multiplies in the dark crevices of frightened society's preoccupation with a sense of self-censorship. Speaking of, the self-quarantine nowadays is going to do all sorts of weird things, like really weird things, because this is true. When you ban something and all of a sudden people do stuff that just, it breeds in the, where you're not seeing stuff, so it is going to cause all sorts of weird problems, this self-quarantining at the moment. We just have to wait and see what comes out of the other side of it. Once pornography is exposed to the strong sunlight of a completely free and uninhibited people, Farringer predicted its appeal will surely diminish. I don't think he was right about that. Like John Stuart Mill, who famously argued that censorship robs the human race of the opportunity to exchanging error for truth, liberal opponents of obscenity regulation believe that the censorship of sexually explicit materials robs the human race of the opportunity of exchanging obscenity's tawdry thrill for more dignified and authentic pleasures. Yeah, this is very patronistic. Yeah, and what makes them think their authentic pleasures are so good? That's why. During the sex wars, feminists assailed this ambivalent liberal defense of sexual expression on multiple fronts, while anti-pornography feminists contested liberal claims of pornography's harmlessness by insisting that pornography played an integral role in the oppression of women. Sex radical feminists challenged liberal sexual politics from another direction. Committed to a robust vision of sexual freedom that necessitated a vibrant, diverse, and public sexual culture, sex radical feminists found liberal ambivalent defenses of sexual expression inadequate and problematic. Not only did they leave the stigma traditionally attached to sex and sexual expression undisputed, they evinced a deeper failure on the part of liberals to look beyond the freedom to peruse a narrow range of sexually explicit materials in private without fear of legal sanction to a broader, queer sexual freedom. As sexual feminist author and activist Pat Khalifa explained, while most people want to visit sexes or a brother or a shooting gallery, get a fix, and then go home without getting busted, sex radical feminists wanted something more. I want the freedom to be as queer, as perverted on the street and on the job as I am in my dungeon. Khalifa, a founding member of the San Francisco-based lesbian S&M group Samoa, declared, securing this freedom meant upending what fellow Samoa members and leading sex radical, I don't know if I'm saying that right, it could be Samoans, and leading sex radical feminist theorist Gail Rubin described it as the system of sexual oppression, a Kafkaesque nightmare of laws, norms, and social practices designed to reward monogamous, heterosexual, vanilla sex and punish the rest. Such a grandiose project of sexual liberation far outstripped anything even the staunchest anti-censorship liberal ever proposed. Yeah, there's a bunch of history here. I wonder how many more pages. I mean, interesting history, but a lot of history here. Good to know, though. Liberals' failure to confront sexual oppression in all its facets and embrace a more comprehensive vision of sexual freedom made them frequent targets of sexual radical feminist critique. For instance, in an article published in The Advocate in 1980, Khalifa criticized the testimony that Attorney Heather Grant Florence offered on behalf of the ACLU at the congressional hearing for Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation Act in 1977. According to Califia, Florence's only objection to the bill, which made it felony to photograph or film a child under the age of 16 years age in the nude, engage in sexual activity with another person, or masturbating, was the threat it posed to the First Amendment. In Califia's view, this liberal objection missed the point. What was at stake in the proposal was not only or even primarily expressive freedom, but the sexual freedom of young people, their adult friends and lovers, gays and lesbians, and other marginalized sexual minorities who were likely to bear the brunt of any law enforcement crackdown on sex crime. By failing to object to the committee's position that sex is bad for children, even suggesting that it would be appropriate to increase the legal penalties for adults who have sex with minors, Califia believed that Florence and the ACLU betrayed the cause of sexual freedom and aided the oppression of some of the most vulnerable second-class sexual citizens. Califia offered a similar critique of the testimony Florence and other prominent civil libertarians offered in the 1986 Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, more commonly known as the Meese Commission. A lot of the people who turned up to testify before the commission on behalf of the First Amendment, Califia did not focus their testimony on the issue of pornography and chose to instead speak out the dangerous impact that censorship would have on the arts, theater, and literature. As Califia saw it, the failure of these liberals to stand up at the Meese Commission and say, "I want to be able to see somebody get spanked, tied up, and soundly fucked in full-color film with a gorgeous soundtrack," left an opening for the Justice Department to implement many of the Commission's most draconian recommendations, including crackdown on queer S&M and S&M pornography, which were easier for authorities to cast as beyond the pale of the First Amendment than more sexual orthodox fare, by operating within rather than against normative confines of the system of sexual oppression. Liberal defenders of expressive freedom failed to vindicate the sexual freedom of the most sexually vulnerable. As this brief discussion illustrates, during the sex war's earliest years, sex radical feminists and anti-censorship liberals were profoundly at odds. In the face of liberal claims that sexual expression was private, apolitical, and harmless, sex radical feminists figured the freedom of sexual expression as one integral part of much larger sexual freedom to craft, cultivate, and live out diverse sexual desires and identities in public in the context of erotically nurturing communities. Despite these profound differences, in the mid-1980s, as anti-pornography feminists championed a municipal ordinance making pornography civilly actionable as sex discrimination, tensions between sex radical feminists and anti-censorship liberals began to ease as an improbable liberal variant of sex radical feminism began to take shape. Okay, keep going. So, page 8 of 22. From sex radical to sex positive feminism. In the fall of 1983, at the request of the city of Minneapolis, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon drafted the first version of their pornography civil rights ordinance, premised on anti-pornography feminism's defining dogma that pornography threatens women's physical, political, and economic well-being. The ordinance consists of a series of amendments to Minneapolis' existing civil rights code. It singled out pornography as a form of sex discrimination and defined specific acts, including trafficking pornography, as civil rights violations. The Minneapolis City Council passed what eventually became known as the Dworkin-McKinnon Ordinance twice before December 1983 and July 1984. Both times, Minneapolis Mayor Don Fraser vetoed it, citing First Amendment concerns. The ordinance fared better in Indianapolis, where it was passed into law in the spring of 1984. Over the next 2 years, versions of the Dworkin-McKinnon Ordinance were also considered in Suffolk County, New York, Madison, Wisconsin, Bellingham, Washington, Los Angeles County, California, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. In most of these cities, coordinated opposition came from anti-pornography feminists' longtime foes, civil libertarian opponents of obscenity regulation. However, in several instances, traditional liberal coalitions of booksellers, publishing trade associations, and state civil liberty unions were joined by the sex radical feminists acting under the aegis of a new organization, the Feminist Anti-Censorship Task Force. FACT. Good acronym. According to FACT, co-founder Carol Vance, FACT was formed in the fall of '84 in response to the introduction of a Dworkin-McKinnon-style anti-pornography ordinance in Suffolk County, New York. Within a year, FACT chapters has sprung up in Madison, Wisconsin, Los Angeles, California, and Cambridge, Massachusetts to oppose and enact oppose the enactment of Indianapolis-style anti-pornography laws. To this end, FACT engaged in a variety of activities, including offering formal testimony at public hearings concerning the ordinance, organizing a street theater action in protest of the 1986 Attorney General Commissions on Pornography, publishing Caught Looking, a tabloid-style book that paired essays criticizing anti-pornography feminism with sexually explicit photographs and illustrations. However, FACT's most influential intervention was an amicus curiae brief it submitted on behalf of the plaintiffs in a legal challenge to the version of the Dworkin-McKinnon ordinance enacted by the City of Indianapolis, American Booksellers versus Hudnut. Authored by feminist legal scholars Nan Hunter and Sylvia Law, and signed by what the radical feminist periodical Off Our Backs described as an extraordinary wide range of feminists, from veteran sex radicals like Anne Hollenbaugh and Gail Rubin to civil libertarians, attorneys like Nadine Strawson and David Richards. The FACT brief sought to persuade the Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit that the Indianapolis ordinance was unconstitutional. To this end, the brief marshaled two primary arguments. First, the brief maintained the ordinance definition of pornography was unconstitutionally vague. When paired with the ordinance trafficking provision, it amounted to a license to censor a virtually limitless number of materials, including experimentations in feminist art, in violation of First Amendment's free speech guarantee. Second, the brief contended by defining pornography in gender-specific terms as the graphic sexual explicit subordination of women, the ordinance resonated with the traditional concept of that sex itself degrades women. In FACT's view, the sexually explicit speech was not per se sexist or harmful to women, and law designed to protect women from such dubious harm perpetuated central sexist stereotypes and violated the 14th Amendment's equal protection guarantee. Judged solely on the basis of these arguments, the FACT brief appeared to be a conventional liberal effort. It figures sexually explicit expression for the most part as harmless and denounces attempts to regulate as censorious encroachments on the freedom of speech. Even the FACT brief's novel deployment of the Equal Protection Clause was in keeping with the traditional liberal claim of that obscenity regulation is patronizing and paternalistic. However, despite these affinities, the FACT brief was no straightforward rehearsal of the liberal creed. In fact, it flouted liberal convention in many ways. For instance, its bold vindication of sexual speech as political and highly relevant to our decision-making as citizens on a wide range of social and ethical issues is a far cry from the liberals' traditionally ambivalent defenses of sexual expression as private and therefore permissible in only a few discrete settings. Similarly, the FACT brief's argument that the Indianapolis ordinance would exacerbate the massive discrimination endured by sexual minorities by making their already marginalized erotica even more susceptible to suppression was not an argument that had traditionally emanated from liberal quarters. Finally, the FACT's brief dominant theme, apart from the threat the Indianapolis ordinance posed to expressive freedom in general, was a fear that, if enacted, the Indianapolis ordinance would furnish conservatives with an effective tool for the curtailment of women's freedom appropriate for themselves, the traditional male language of sexuality. Such concern for women's ability to express unladylike, unfeminine, aggressive, power-charged, pushy, vulgar, urgent, confident, and intense ideas about sex was a definite departure from liberal orthodoxy. That the FACT brief both defied and reproduced the conventional liberal line on... if you can hear the music, this is the theme to Running Man. Always great. That the FACT brief both defied and reproduced the conventional liberal line on free speech points to what is, in my view, the most significant aspect of FACT's intervention. Although many FACT's founders and supporters were self-radical feminists committed to an expansive vision of sexual freedom that exceeded conventional liberal structures, the organization was guided by a strategic vision that held that effective political action consists in appropriating, transforming, and deploying the friendliest discourses in order to counter the most hostile ones. In keeping with the strategy, FACT co-founder Lisa Dugan has explained FACT appropriated the rhetoric of anti-censorship along with the accompanying framework of civil liberties to construct what Dugan calls a bridge discourse connecting the reform politics of liberal and progressive groups to the more radical politics of sex radical feminism. By speaking in a liberal idiom, Fact was able to hitch a sex radical feminism's ambitious agenda, which included resisting sexual oppression in all its forms and creating a vibrant and diverse public sexual culture, to be a familiar and much less threatening liberal politics of free speech and civil liberties. That's what I kind of where they thought they were going earlier, because I don't know any of this stuff. When I said that you have to hitch yourself to like where you have to go where the power is sometimes to get something done, so that's kind of what they did. You can't, if you go by yourself and blaze your own trail, you're gonna end up being alone, and you just can't. You need an army for some of these things, and you're not gonna. If you go out by yourself, you're just gonna be a martyr. You're not gonna. I mean, maybe it'll come after you, but you're not gonna get a whole lot done in your lifetime. This enabled Fact to make not only an effective case against the Dworkin-McKinnon Ordinance, but a lasting contribution to liberal thought as well. Fact's strategic deployment of liberal rhetoric led directly to the creation of a new discourse on pornography and sexual freedom that I provide an alternative to the ambivalent one liberals traditionally employed. I call this new liberal feminist hybrid discourse anti-censorship pro-sex feminism. A key articulation in the popularization of anti-censorship pro-sex feminism was Nadine Strawson, as president of the ACLU from 1991 to 2008. That's a long time. Founder of Feminists for Free Expression and a member of the National Coalition Against Censorship's Working Group on Women's Censorship and Pornography, Strawson worked to dispel what she called the widespread misperception that feminists and civil libertarians were fundamentally at odds over pornography. According to Strawson, feminism and civil liberties are inextricable, and the anti-censorship position, customarily grounded in free speech and First Amendment principles, also found sustenance in feminist principles and concerns. To support this claim, Strawson drew on the arguments and ideas of sex radical feminists. Censoring pornography, Strawson insisted, would not only violate cherished First Amendment freedoms, it would hinder women's efforts to develop their own sexuality, exacerbate the oppression of lesbians and other sexual minorities, harm women who voluntarily work in the sex industry, and undermine essential aspects of human freedom, including sexual freedom. Such contentions, originally put forward by sex radical feminists as alternative to the limited defenses of sexual freedom, anti-censorship liberals espoused, became in Strawson's hand evidence of the falseness of the purported dichotomy between feminist and civil libertarian principles, once portrayed by sexual feminists as an inadequate response to a Kafkaesque system of sexual oppression. Liberalism's narrow sexual politics of anti-censorship and expression and expressive freedom were now passing as sex radical feminist sexual politics. I'm amazed I didn't trip up saying all those big words. Let me take one sec. Take a breath. So, hoping someone has a fun read along with this one. Despite the willingness of anti-censorship pro-sex feminists like Strawson to figure sexuality as an intrinsically valuable domain of human experience, yeah, sorry, talk on the chats. Where am I? Yes, the problem is that reading in two spots is hard. Despite the willingness like Strawson as an intrinsically valuable domain of humans to express concerns for the rights of some sexual minorities in the course of defending. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, glad you're here. You're one of my had a viewer yesterday. I think it was my brother, and or 2 days ago, whatever it was. So I'm reading this paper. If you wanna, where'd the link go? If you wanna look it up, you can download it. Yeah, like click over there. Yeah, this is the stuff I'm looking at right now. So yeah. Yeah, let me put that in the chat so you can see that thing. Yeah, you don't have to follow along, but yeah, I'm just reading through this now. I'm kind of in the middle. Give me a few minutes and we'll get through it. First Amendment liberties. Where am I? First Amendment. This fusion of anti-censorship liberalism and sex radical feminism did not extend liberal sexual politics beyond. Okay, we'll have a fun time then. You're just gonna hear me droning on for a while though. Like their liberal forebears, anti-censorship pro-sex feminists consistently fail to exhibit concern for sexual freedom beyond expressive freedom, or to address forms of sexual oppression beyond state censorship. These failures are evident in polluting the censorship debate, a report issued by the ACLU in July of 1986 to criticize the findings of the Meese Commission. Although this report offers this sort of bold and unequivocal defense of sexual expression qua sexual expression that eluded even the staunchest civil libertarians for generations, it stops far short of pursuing a sex radical feminist politics of sexual freedom. For instance, the report defends constitutionally protected expression like pornography by insisting on its distinctiveness from criminal conduct such as pandering, that is pimping, and prostitution. As the report argues, if producing film or pictures, not sexual gratification of money, is the primary purpose of the actor's work, then that work can in no way be called prostitution, and paying actors' salaries can in no way be called pandering. This argument for the legitimacy of pornography as constitutionally protected expression, an argument it is worth remembering that prior liberals had been unwilling to make, tacitly endorses the criminalization of commercial sex works like prostitution. Such an argument would have been untenable to sex radical feminists who were concerned with a sexual freedom that far outstripped expressive freedom and encompassed the right to engage in commercial sex without fear of stigma or punishment. The stance on laws regulating child pornography and intergenerational sex adopted by the ACLU in this report is also at odds with a sex radical feminist politics of sexual freedom. While sex radical feminists like Gail Rubin and Pat Califia oppose the age of consent and child pornography laws as oppressive denials of the sexual autonomy of young people and unjust threats to civil liberties as sexual freedoms of many adults, the ACLU report shows little concern for either of these matters. In fact, the report clearly states that while the ACLU believes that child pornography poses a threat to constitutionally protected speech, the organization also agrees with the Meese Commission that the vast bulk of child pornography does present the non-consensual violation of child's rights, and the criminal law should proceed with increased vigor against those who commit the underlying conduct which results in the sexually explicit photographs of children. There is much to be done. The ACLU report continues to reach those who finance these photographic production, those who procure the children with various degrees of coercion into making the photos, those who engage in sexual activities with the children, as well as other knowing and willful participants who aid and abet molestation. The possibility that so-called child pornography depicts benign and consensual acts, or that a criminal crackdown on molestation might make already stigmatized sexual minorities even more vulnerable to harassment and persecution, is not entertained by the ACLU, whose sole concern is expressive freedom, not sexual freedom along the lines envisioned by sex radical feminists. Yeah. As the ACLU's official response to the findings of the Meese Commission indicates, the strategic appropriation of civil liberties rhetoric by sex radical feminists yielded ambiguous results. While the Dworkin-McKinnon Ordinance was defeated and space for a more robust defense of sexual expression was opened up within the conceptual confines of liberalism, these achievements came at a price. Many of sex radical feminism defining features, its expansive vision of sexual freedom, and its concern with modes of sexual oppression beyond state censorship did not survive liberal translation. Yeah, you're going to lose something if you're only talking about freedom of speech. I mean, not everything is speech. I mean, in America, everything is dollar, but apparently not sex. So, in the end, sex radical feminist attempts to strategically deploy liberalism in the service of their radical ends got away from them and gave rise to the attenuated sexual politics of anti-censorship, pro-sex feminism. Adherents to this new liberal feminist hybrid position deployed select aspects of sex radical feminism. Feminists thought to do what liberals had always done: defend the expression of sexually orthodox ideas against state censorship. Meanwhile, aspects of sex radical feminism that were not readily assimilable to this long-standing liberal project, including its challenge to a vast socio-legal apparatus that targets dissident sexualities for regulation and punishment, fell into disuse and obscurity. Yeah, that's sad. Okay. Moving along, though. Moving along. Anti-censorship this is reasonably well written given the big words that are in this paper, so this is not terrible. I had a paper the other day that they had these weird neologisms and it would just turn the whole thing into a tongue twister. This history of the convergence of liberalism and sex radical feminism during the sex wars bears important implications for evaluating contemporary feminist interventions like SlutWalk. In a superficial sense, at least SlutWalk movement shares certain affinities with the feminist positions articulated in both sides of the sex wars. For instance, its emphasis on the broader societal and cultural factors that produce sexual violence bears an obvious resemblance to anti-pornography feminism. Equally obvious is SlutWalk's continuity, at least with some aspects, with the audacious spirit of public sexual assertion characteristic of sex radical feminism. However, hailing the SlutWalk movement as a rapprochement between anti-pornography feminism and sex radical feminism leaves many of its most important facets unaccounted for. For example, in a recent study of SlutWalk movement, Caitlin Mendez notes that in addition to challenging rape culture, one of the movement's central priorities has been combating slut-shaming, promoting respect for the individual and the variety of choices they make, including freedom to dress how they want. SlutWalk's Toronto co-founder Heather Jarvis has foregrounded this facet of the movement. When asked in an interview about SlutWalk Toronto's controversial decision to reappropriate the word slut, Jarvis explained that while she completely respects people who have criticized her effort to reclaim the charged term, the use of the word slut in a positive context is a choice for some people, and she wants more choice, not less. This emphasis on self-expression and personal choice, especially as it pertains to conventionally feminine and heterosexual women who bear the brunt of the slut stigma, distinguishes SlutWalk rather starkly from the sexual politics of sex radical feminism. Prior to their strategic appropriation of liberal anti-censorship rhetoric in the mid-1980s, sex radical feminists vindicated a vision of sexual freedom so expansive that it seems scandalous and utopian even today. They demanded not merely more space for individual women to enact fairly conventional forms of feminine heterosexuality, but an end to all legal and extra-legal methods of enforcing erotic conformity, including statutory rape laws, child pornography laws prohibiting public sex, family violence, employment and housing discrimination, and psychiatric diagnoses and hegemonic norms that punish the perverse and reward the normal. In stark contrast, the SlutWalk movement shows little interest in addressing these multifarious forms of sexual oppression. In fact, rather than critically interrogating the erotic conformity enacted by slutwalkers parading around in marching bra and panty sets calling themselves sluts, as the ambivalent effect of a sexual system of sexual oppression that makes alternative erotic possibilities virtually unthinkable, the SlutWalk movement valorizes these performances of a commonplace, even hackneyed feminine heterosexual as hard-won products of individual struggle and choice. And she's coming down kind of hard on them. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a she, whoever the author is here. Author is coming down hard. Alright, well, you're going to put some smack down, you put some smack down on some people. So, such willful disregard for sexual oppression broadly conceived signals not only the SlutWalks movement's discontinuity with sex radical feminism, but its continuity with anti-censorship pro-sex feminism. For anti-censorship pro-sex feminists like Nadine Strawson, sexual freedom was not the freedom to be as queer, as perverted on the street and on the job as you are or in your dungeon, but the freedom to express conventional ideas about sex and gender without being subject to state censorship. This narrow conception of sexual freedom is very much akin to the sexual freedom sought by the SlutWalk movement, the freedom to dress how you want, be sexual in your own way, and publicly perform a normative feminine heterosexuality without being judged or sanctioned. The SlutWalk movements, and I wonder if I should not use SmackDown. Who knows? The SlutWalk movement investment in a narrow and individualist vision of sexual freedom fuels another aspect of the movement that marks a stark departure from sex radical feminism. As I've already noted, the SlutWalk movement seeks not only to combat sexual assault, but to do so in a way that celebrates rather than critically interrogates the limits of women's freedom to express their sexuality in whatever way they choose. Honoring these dual commitments requires the SlutWalk movement to respond to the problem of sexual violence without engaging in critiques of normative scripts of heterosexuality and gender that might have a chilling effect on individual choice and expression. Faced with this quandary of resisting sexual violence while refraining from questioning the norms that support it, the SlutWalk movement falls back on a striking carceral solution. In its rhetoric and messaging, SlutWalk places virtually all responsibility for sexual assault on the individual perpetrators and figures on the carceral state as a guarantor of women's sexual freedom. Yeah. There's a fallback to the justice system here. Or the state power, yeah. As I noted in the introduction, the carceral thrust of the SlutWalk movement has been evident from its advent in Toronto, despite the fact that the original SlutWalk was inspired by outrage at police complicity in rape culture. Its primary message was an appeal to police for protection and respect. We want the Toronto Police Service to take serious steps to regain our trust. SlutWalk Toronto demanded via its website, we want to feel that we will be respected and protected should we ever need them, but more importantly to be certain that those charged with our safety have a true understanding of what it is to be a survivor of sexual assault, slut, or otherwise. Similarly, a similar appeal emanated from a SlutWalk march in New York City in October of 2011, despite the fact that the protest occurred only a few months after the acquittal of 2 NYPD officers accused of raping a woman while on duty, and only one day after reported surfaced that police investigated a series of rapes in Brooklyn's Park Slope neighborhood, or warning women against wearing skirts or dresses because they provide easy access. SlutWalk New York figured police as agents of sexual and gender justice, carrying signs bearing messages like punish rapists, not victims, and NYPD target Brooklyn rapists, not women. SlutWalk New York demonstrators call on police to use the full force of their power on behalf of survivors to catch and punish the rapists. SlutWalk New York organizer Sammy Lifson even couched her critique of victim blaming and slut shaming in terms of police efficacy. The cops in Park Slope have really stepped up their presence and they're trying to be helpful, Lifson told a reporter at the event. But to focus on women isn't going to help catch the perpetrator. As these remarks reveal, the goal of these North American SlutWalks was not to highlight police and law enforcement complicity in sexual violence and rape culture, but to figure the slut as a supplicant before the law deserving of its benevolent protection as any other citizen. Yeah. By framing the slut as a vulnerable subject entitled to the state's protection, the SlutWalk movement employs what Iris Marion Young calls the logic of masculine protection. According to this logic, men are gallantly masculine protectors who face the world's difficulties and dangers in order to shield women from harm, while women are submissive objects of love and guardianship who adore their protectors, happily defer to their judgment in return for the promise of security. Well, when this gendered logic is extrapolated to the macro level of the modern state, the outcome is authoritarian. Cast in the role of benevolent masculine protector, the state's power to surveil, police, detain, and repress in the name of security of its feminized citizenry is virtually limitless. While the SlutWalks movement challenges the logic of masculine protection at the micro level by repudiating slut shaming and insisting that the woman be treated as autonomous sexual subjects regardless of their sexual choices, its macro level demand that police respect and protect sluts just as they would any other citizen bolsters the carceral state's image as masculine protector and aggrandizes its power. The SlutWalks movement faith in the carceral state's capacity to protect and ultimately liberate is not something it inherited from its sex radical feminist forebears. As I've shown prior to the strategic alliance of sex radical feminists with anti-censorship liberals in the mid-1980s, sex radical feminists were ruthlessly critical of the criminal justice system. In Gail Rubin's analysis, the carceral state was not an ally of the feminist struggle for sexual freedom, but a part of a vast system of sexual oppression, that Kafkaesque nightmare in which unlucky victims became herds of human cattle whose identification, surveillance, apprehension, treatment, and incarceration and punishment produced jobs and self-satisfaction for thousands of vice, police, prison officials, psychiatrists, and social workers. However, as sex radical feminism resolved into a more conventional anti-censorship policy of the late 80s and early 90s, its characteristic suspicion of the carceral state all but vanished. Yeah, you can't just... Yeah, that seems like a bad mistake. Well, at least this paper is making it seem like a very bad mistake. I'm sure there's another side to this, but running to the state to assume it's going to work in your favor is rolling the dice at best, especially when it hasn't got a great history of this sort of thing. intent on vindicating an individual's right to free expression, but wary of undermining the boundaries between the perverse and the normal, that liberal defenses of expression and freedom had always bolstered and relied on anti-censorship pro-sex feminists defended the freedom of the individuals to engage in conventional forms of sexual expression, while tacitly accepting, or in some cases vigorously endorsing, the criminal regulation of other highly stigmatized forms of sexual conduct. One sees this carceral defense of expression freedom at work in the ACLU's official report on the findings of the Mies Commission. While the report offers a bold defense of sexual expression qua expression, it also advocates the criminalization of a variety of forms of sexual conduct, including prostitution, pandering, intergenerational sex, and child pornography, broadly defined. While it may seem counterintuitive to claim that liberalism, with its emphasis on individual liberty, limited government, and a sacrosanct private realm of thought and belief, helped forge a feminist politics that aggrandizes the carceral state, this is precisely what seems to have occurred in the case of anti-censorship pro-sex feminism, a dogged commitment on the part of the anti-censorship pro-sex feminists. See, this is the time when you could have had an acronym. Because writing that a million times and saying a million times is hard. Feminists to expressive freedom supplanted a broader sex radical feminist vision of sexual freedom and led to the endorsement of a variety of laws criminalizing the very marginalized sexualities that sex radical feminists had once championed. A similar dynamic is plainly evident in North American SlutWalks. Committed to a narrow conception of sexual freedom qua expressive freedom, the SlutWalk movement holds up aggressive law enforcement as the key to securing women's freedom to look at and live as sluts if they so choose. Constrained by this liberal aim, the SlutWalk movement fails to address the carceral state's complicity in sexual oppression, particularly the widespread sexual abuse and harassment of prisoners, queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people, and sex workers. Sex radical feminists were once sharply attuned to this complicity. Recovering their analysis can help contemporary feminists look beyond a narrow liberal politics of expressive freedom and toward a anti-carceral approaches to sexual liberation that center on restorative justice and community accountability. A feminist movement that is serious about sexual pleasure and freedom must contest the power of the carceral state, not intensify it. A liberal politics of expressive freedom, no matter how vigorously sex positive, is simply not up to this vital task. Okay, and that's it. Alright. Yeah. So this is an interesting paper on the history of feminist politics, and how the current stuff, which may at first have appeared to be, as they said, a sort of a culmination of these different things, really is not any sort of detente, but it's very much in one party's favor, with just taking a few useful terms from the other one. So, the question is, this is a history here, and it's like a narrative history. Do I actually know anything enough about this? Unfortunately, not. It's well argued, but it's presenting the history in a certain way, and I do not have the background to counteract some of the claims here that would trip up this sort of argument. It's interesting stuff, but I just have to assume that everything is well put together. So, fine. It was good. It was well written, and yeah, not a whole lot more to say, but good article. Check it out if you so wish. Alright, thanks for watching, and hope you have a good day. It's too bad I didn't have a whole lot to say about that, but stay safe out there, and I think I'll be back tomorrow morning at 10:30. Hope to see you then.